This video is dedicated to a white audience, but whatever goes on the internet becomes available to all. So the purpose is to help whites understand themselves and help non-whites understand whites. I've just understood an idea, so I want to share this idea with the world. In our day and age, many political and psychological conflicts revolve around the notion of the oppressor and the oppressed, the victim and the perpetrator. And in the collective psyche of the Western world, the image of the oppressor is the image of the white, heterosexual, German, nationalist male. In other words, Adolf Hitler. The oppressor in the collective psyche of the Western world is Adolf Hitler, because he is white, heterosexual, German, nationalist, and male. And these determinations will be important in the following of the video. And in the Western world also, the image of the victim is that of the Jew, because they have been historically oppressed by Europeans, but most accurately and in important proportions by the Germans during the Second World War. So the Jews have the image of the victims of German, nationalist, white, heterosexual, masculine oppression. And many people in the Western world define themselves and determine it and define their identity in relation to the reciprocal relationship of victim-oppressor. And there are, not all, but there are many blacks in America who define themselves as being historically oppressed by white, heterosexual, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant males. Some Asians in the US define themselves as being oppressed by the same group of people, because there have been oppression of Asians in the United States by whites. Mexican and Hispanics, they define themselves in the US, not all of them, but some of them, as being victims or as having been oppressed by the WASP. The native Indians, of course, some of them define themselves as being historically having been oppressed and having been the victims of the actions of white, heterosexual, Anglo-Saxon males. And the more you participate, in the Platonic sense, to the idea of the oppressor that I have defined, white, heterosexual, German, nationalist, male, the more you are an oppressor, and the less you participate in this idea, the more you are a victim. This will be important. So the WASP are not the ultimate oppressors because they are not German. They are either English or American or Australian or Canadian or South African or New Zealand, but they are not German. So they are not the ultimate oppressors. They are relative oppressors, but they themselves, as we show later, they can claim that historically they have been oppressed by the Germans because Hitler invaded or tried to invade Britain, and he declared war on the United States. And in the First World War, the Germans fought against the English. So if you are a white, heterosexual, Anglo-Saxon, nationalist male, you can still claim to be a victim, being a victim of German oppression. So there are different degrees. There's a continuum of in the logical spectrum of oppression. There's a continuum, and as long as you're not the German oppressor, you are relatively a victim, so to speak. So then again, in the Western world, the liberal whites claim that they are being oppressed by the conservatives, because the conservatives are patriots or nationalists, and the liberals are cosmopolitan. So the liberal whites claim that they are being oppressed by the conservatives. The conservatives claim that they are being oppressed by the liberal whites, because they say that the liberal whites dominate the news, they dominate the academia, they have the moral high ground. So they both project onto other the relationship of oppression and victimhood. In the far right circles in the West, this is the same logic: victim, oppressor, persecutor, and oppressed. And in the mind of the far right nationalists, they themselves, they are depicted as being the oppressors by everyone else, but they themselves defined themselves as being victims of, in their mind, Jewish oppression. They say the Jews are oppressing us because they control finance, they control the media, they control this and that. And so even a far right, white, heterosexual, nationalist male of any nationality claims to be a victim. And in the far right, or not necessarily far right, but in the right-wing spheres of modern white consciousness, the whites who are leaning on the right, they are unconsciously aware of this logic of victimhood, and they understand that the more you claim to be a victim in today's West, the higher you climb up the social ladder, and the more prestige you get, and the more you can say, I am a victim, I suffer from oppression, the more social status and prestige and power you gain. So unconsciously they want power, they have a will to power, and they think that we cannot gain power by claiming we are the oppressors, so we have to depict ourselves as being the victims. And we are seeing emerging in the right pagan circles the idea that we, as right-wing pagans, we are the victims of the Christians. The Christians killed our ancestors, they enslaved our ancestors. The Jews, of course, the Jews have manipulated our ancestors by controlling the financial system. They have enslaved us economically. So these are the ideas of the Middle Ages. We have been victims of Asian invasions, the barbarian hordes from Asia, the Mongols, the Huns, the tribes from Asia have attacked Europe. The Muslims tried to invade us. The Turks tried to invade us. So we are victims. And there was the Muslim slave trade. There were whites who were being enslaved by the Muslims. So in the right wing, mostly pagan, not necessarily, but in the right-wing white circles in the Western world, these people are projecting an image of themselves as being victims, because they have understood unconsciously that to be a victim in the modern Western world allows you to gain power and prestige and recognition and social status and influence. Yeah. Then I will talk about the relationship of patriotism and nationalism and the various white nationalities. Charles de Gaulle and Winston Churchill are considered by the mainstream in England and in France to be heroes. And if we had to define them broadly, it's too simple, but it gives the broad picture, that they were white, heterosexual, French for Charles de Gaulle and English for Churchill, patriot males. So in the hierarchy of oppressors, they were very high because they participate, to speak like Plato, in the idea that the higher you climb, you participate in what he calls the idea. So they participate in the idea of oppression, but at the same time, they were only patriots, they were not nationalists, and they were only French and English, they were not Germans. And the counterpart of these figures were Philippe Pétain, in France, who was white, heterosexual, French, nationalist male, and he's despised by the French as being the embodiment of evil in 20th century France history. And I guess that in the English world, the counterpart of Philippe Pétain for the French is Oswald Mosley, I guess. For the English, Oswald Mosley, I guess, must be the embodiment of evil within the sphere of England because he was a white, heterosexual, English, nationalist male. So Churchill is the hero, Mosley is the villain within the mind of the English. But we are witnessing a change of consciousness in the development of the consciousness within the Western world, because de Gaulle and Churchill, they were white patriots. They had a certain sense of racial awareness, and this is problematic. And some people, usually on the left, are starting to accuse de Gaulle and Churchill, which are kind of untouchable because they are prestigious, they are the heroes of 20th century France and England, but yet they participated in colonial empire. They were dominant white males, so they were kind of oppressors, and we are starting to see these ideas develop, and they can preserve their reputation because they can claim, those who defend de Gaulle and Churchill, they can claim they were the victims. It's always the logic of victimhood. They were the victims of a white, heterosexual, German nationalist male. And the German is the most oppressive figure in the consciousness of the Western world. So as long as de Gaulle and Churchill can be depicted as being victims of Hitler, they can preserve their reputation. Only Hitler cannot be defended on any ground whatsoever because he is the ultimate oppressor. Yeah. Then we have the counter image of this figure of the oppressor or the perpetrator, but in the figure of, for instance, the white heterosexual cosmopolitan female, the white feminist, if you will. The white feminist can have a sense of identity and self-worth and influence by claiming that historically we have been victims of patriot, nationalist, white, heterosexual males. So we can claim a status of victimhood. But then there comes a problem, because if you are a heterosexual, you participate in a Platonic sense that you have something in common with the ultimate idea of the perpetrator, because Hitler was a heterosexual, and if you are a heterosexual, you are participating in the idea of Hitler, which is the embodiment of oppression and evil. So there's a higher degree in victimhood. It's to be a white homosexual cosmopolitan female. If you are lesbian, you are more victim, because historically the lesbians and the homosexuals have been oppressed by the heterosexuals. So if you are a white lesbian cosmopolitan female, you are a victim, and you are more a victim than the heterosexual feminist. That's the logic. But then again, if you are a white lesbian, a cosmopolitan, you are still white. So you are participating in the idea of oppression. So you are still an oppressor in relation to, for instance, a black homosexual cosmopolitan female. If you are black, if you are lesbian, if you are a globalist or a cosmopolitan, and if you are a female, you are almost the perfect victim. But can there be, because historically, as a black, you have been oppressed by whites. As a homosexual, you have been oppressed by heterosexual. As a cosmopolitan, you have been oppressed by patriots and nationalists. And as a female, you have been oppressed by males. So you have all the criteria of the perfect victim. But one can say, is there, it is possible to be even more of a victim, and then you have to enter the mind of the white racists with their racial classification. And in the mind of a white racist, there are a hierarchy of races and superior races, inferior races. And the inferior race in the mind of the racist is probably the Australian Aborigine. I don't know exactly why, but in the idea, they are considered by the racists to be the most primitive people. So one could imagine that I am penetrating the depth of the white psyche, and it is so twisted. I will publish the video. I will be despised for having laughed, but this is so twisted. The white psyche is so complicated and so ludicrous. I will be honest to God. I will be punished for having laughed, but I will choose the path of ruthless honesty. In the mind of white racists, the Australian Aborigines are considered to be the inferior race. So one could imagine an Australian Aborigine, homosexual, cosmopolitan female who could claim the status of being the ultimate victim. Victim of whites, victim of heterosexuals, victim of patriots and nationalists, and victim of males. So that would be the perfect victim, I guess. Then, I will tell an anecdote. I read in the news the other day, a white leftist female, probably a feminist, I don't know, an ecologically-minded white leftist female, who attended a meeting of ecologically-minded people, and she said that she had the feeling of being in a meeting of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. So this is how the white psyche functions. This was a meeting of good-hearted, morally good, white ecologists who probably in their daily life, they cannot be reproached, they recycle their trash, they limit their consumption of resources, they use their bike to move instead of their car, they care about every gesture that they do not to pollute the planet, they are probably very good people. But for this female ecologist, white leftist, it's not enough, because when whites are gathered together, even if it is for the sake of doing good, for caring about the entire planet, the entire world, the future generation, the future children, that's not enough, because they are white. And white who gather together, it participates in the idea of white gatherings, the KKK, oppression of blacks. It's almost a Nazi meeting in her mind. So this is how the white psyche functions. I speak here as a white. We are insane. We are a crazy people, and we suffer of our own insanity, because whatever we do, we feel guilty. And every people, I guess, on the planet, whatever their ethnicity, feel remorse and shame and guilt. But we whites, we feel remorse for whatever we do. And then I will talk about some of the figures of consciousness in the modern world. There are these white Republican conservatives who say that I don't care if America becomes a brown country as long as we can keep our guns. What this means is that the white psyche is willing to abolish itself ethnically in order that the ideas of the white race, namely the right to own gun, which is a manifestation of the will to freedom and preservation against the oppression of the state and the ruling class. So those white conservative Republican Americans who claim, I don't care if America becomes Mexico, as long as the idea of gun ownership, which is a determination of freedom, remains, as long as the ideas of the white race survives the disappearance of the whites. This is what they mean. In France, but in every white country, the teachers, the white leftist, most of the teachers are white leftist, they want to share white culture. They do not say that it's white culture, because if you say French culture is white culture, they would say, what are you saying? Culture is universal. It belongs to the people of all the world. To say that the French are whites, wouldn't you be a Nazi? That's how the white psyche functions. They want to share culture. I guess it's the same in every white country. White leftist teachers in America want to share American culture. In English, that's the same. And there's a problem in their psyche, because I guess it's more prominent in America, because should we really share the culture of white Americans, knowing that white Americans participate in the idea of oppression? Shouldn't we teach children black literature or Native Indian literature? Do we really have to teach, what's his name, Hawthorne or Melville or Steinbeck? I don't know who is taught in the American schools, but I'm sure that there are white leftist teachers who think, why am I forced to teach white literature to kids, because white are oppressors and we should abolish white literature? So there's probably this conflict in the mind of some whites. But in England, I guess that Shakespeare is taught, or Wordsworth or Coleridge, or I don't know, I'm not knowledgeable in English literature, Milton probably, Pope and Orwell and the great English writers. So the leftist white male teachers are in a conflict because they want to share the highest production of the English mind with more and more non-white kids, Pakistani, Afghan, Indian, Nigerian, whatever. But they want to prove that English culture is not English, but it's universal. It's the product of the whole of mankind. So for them, that's not a problem, and that's even a good thing to share, to abolish the English people by making English culture transcend the ethnic boundaries. I'm sure you get the idea. Then, in the mind of Catholics, the entire history of the Catholic missionaries for the past 500 years is an attempt to share the Catholic religion with non-whites. They have this will to convert the non-whites to what they think is a European religion, although it originates in Judaism, but has historically been mostly the religion of Europeans on the longer perspective. And the Catholics, they want to convert non-whites to Catholicism. The Protestants probably also, but the Protestants are more nationalist. They are more, historically, the Protestants are not as do not have the same will to convert non-members of the national community to Protestantism. It also exists, this will to expand also, but it's more prominent in the Catholic than in the Protestant. So whatever whites do, they want to abolish themselves. And all the whites who are not far-right white extremists, white nationalists, they want to abolish the white race. And the far-right white nationalists are the only whites in the world who want to preserve the ethnic existence of whites. All other Republicans, conservatives, right-wing conservatives, they unconsciously, they do not care about the biological existence of the white race. They want only white ideas to survive. Only the far right wants the biological aspect of the white race to be preserved. Yeah. And the European Union, in its very structure, the whole purpose of the European Union is to abolish the white race from an ethnical standpoint, to promote laws and policies which in the long run will lead to the disappearance, or either by childlessness or slow death by natural or criminal causes, or by miscegenation. But the purpose of the European Union is to create a European continent which in 80 years, 100 years, 120 years, there will be no white left on the European soil. This is the entire purpose of the European Union. And the only coherent way to oppose the European Union is either to think, that's the mind of far-right white nationalists, either non-whites should all be deported, excluded from Europe, and sent back from wherever they come from, or ethno-states should be created and non-whites should be allowed to live on European soil but in their own state, and whites should create ethno-states for whites only, so a new apartheid on European soil to preserve their biological existence. This is the only coherent way of opposing the European Union. And all those who do not adopt these ideas, they are incoherent in a sense that the conservative, for instance, they want to preserve in Europe heterosexual marriage, or they are against contraceptive pills or abortion, or they want to preserve cultural values or whatever. But in the long run, this way of opposing the abolition of the white race from a biological standpoint is not enough, because you could have a European continent populated by a mixed race population of blacks, Northern African, Asians, of vaguely atheist or Muslim, whatever. You could have this mass of non-white, non-Christian or non-pagan peoples, and still have the contraceptive pill would be still forbidden, and the people could have conservative values, because the Muslims are conservative, most of them, and they could have heterosexual marriage and prohibition of homosexual marriage. So you could have all the values of the conservatives in a completely non-white Europe. So, yeah. And now I talk about the situation in Ukraine. There are white Ukrainians and white Russians dying every day. And in the mind of the whites of Western Europe, that's a problem, because they depict the Russians as the aggressors, the oppressors, the persecutors, which, because Russians are white, most of them, they participate in the idea of the oppressor, so that's not a problem for them to blame oppression on Russians. But then the white leftists are confronted by a psychological problem. How can we depict the Ukrainians, who are a white people, as victims? Because in their own worldview, if you are white, you cannot really be a victim. Maybe if you are a female, but you participate in the idea of oppression. So the white psyche is confronted by the problem of presenting whites who have been defined by the left for the past 60 years as being oppressors. Now there are whites who are being oppressed. They are being killed and hurt. So how can you present a white male as a victim? That's very difficult. It's almost unthinkable for a leftist. And yeah. And the only idea which can enable the mind of the white leftist of Western Europe to remain stable is the idea that, of course, there are white victims, Ukrainians, but the oppressor is white. So you can still blame oppression on whites, because Putin is white and most Russians are white. So there's this conflict which is constant within the white psyche, the tendency, the polarity between being a victim and being an oppressor. Yeah. So the white psyche is very complicated, very tormented, schizophrenic, and that's the reason why, although whites enjoy material prosperity in comparison to almost all other races, they are less wealthy than some Northeast Asians in Japan or the Jews or some Arab countries, but on average the white standards of living are very high. But it doesn't prevent the white psyche, whether you are on the left or on the right, to suffer. And whites all over the world they are in a constant struggle against themselves, and they are constantly suffering from guilt and shame and a feeling of being victims. And when they don't feel as victims, they feel as oppressors, and then they feel remorse and shame and guilt. So the white psyche is complicated.